That gets us no further forward. You can be an atheist and a fascist. Most fascists were actually Christian. You can be an atheist and a communist. Most, but not all, communists were unbelievers by definition. You can be an atheist and perfectly indifferent to your fellow creatures. But there is a humanism within atheism. It starts, I think, with Lucretius, who put the atomic theory of Democritus and Epicurus into a wonderful poem that effectively suggested not that people were using religion as a crutch, as you so in such a domesticated and furry way put it, but that instead on a very hot day they were putting on a huge heavy overcoat and dragging a ball and chain. Oh dear, my crops have failed, I didn't make enough sacrifices. Oh God, I've had a filthy thought, now I'm going to hell. Or my children are, because I didn't baptize them. Man forged manacles of terror and ignorance and stupidity, the emancipation of which, of our species, has been millimetrically slow, but in which materialist and atheist thinkers have played a great part. Without Lucretius, you only have to read Galileo's work. He's inspired by the work of Lucretius. He considers himself to be very lucky to possess one of the very few copies of Lucretius's work that was not destroyed in the Christian centuries, in the hope of putting an end to such terrible, unwise speculations as that, as so much of Galileo's work was either destroyed or censored. On the thread is passed on. It's picked up by the greatest Jew who ever breathed, Baruch Spinoza, changing his name later after his excommunication from the synagogue to Benedict, who said, if there's a God, he's pantheistic, he's in nature, there's no personal God. Prayers are not answered, divine interventions do not occur. The consolations of philosophy must be resorted to. From him and people like him, we get the Enlightenment, in which not only Danton and Robespierre, ladies and gentlemen, have their share, but Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and the founders of this great republic and the Philadelphia Enlightenment. This is not a tradition of which anyone on my side need be ashamed. And of course, not all of it is atheist, some of it is deist, but it becomes more atheist as Darwin and Einstein and others approach us with their mind-boggling, almost one wants to say mind-altering findings. And you perhaps will say it's a coincidence that Einstein is expelled by the Third Reich, along with anyone else who understood anything about biology or physics. As practitioners of Jewish science, I'm sorry, the area of agreement has just contracted, sir. For you to say of Nazism that it was the implementation of the work of Charles Darwin is a filthy slander, undeserving of you, and an insult to this audience. Darwin's thought was not taught in Germany. Darwinism was derided in Germany, along with every other form of unbelief. All the great modern atheist thinkers, Darwin, Einstein, and Freud, were alike despised by the National Socialist regime. And there is, it said, I believe it to be true, a misprint in one German edition of The Origin of Species, from which the full statement that evolution requires the survival of the fittest is taken, a statement never made by Darwin, who, as anyone knows, says that adaptability is what is likeliest to give survival or luck or advantage, we'd better say, in the struggle. Now, just to take the most notorious of the 20th century totalitarianisms, the most finished example, the most perfected one, the most ruthless and refined one, that of National Socialism, the one that fortunately allowed the escape of all these great atheist thinkers and many others to the United States, country of separation of church and state that gave them welcome. If it's an atheistic regime, then how come that in the first chapter of Mein Kampf, Hitler says he's doing God's work and executing God's will in destroying the Jewish people? How come the Führer oath that every officer of the party and the army had to take, making Hitler into a minor god, begins, I swear in the name of Almighty God, my loyalty to the Führer? How come that on the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier it says Gott mit uns, God on our side? How come that the first treaty made by the National Socialist dictatorship, the very first, is with the Vatican, exchanging political control of Germany for Catholic control of German education? How come that the churches celebrated the birthday of the Führer every day, every year, I mean, on that day, until democracy put an end to this filthy, quasi-religious, superstitious, barbarous, reactionary system. Again, this is not a difference of emphasis between us to suggest that there's something fascistic about me and my beliefs is something I won't hear said, and you shouldn't believe. Thank you.
Dr. Belinsky, your recap, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I've endeavored to assert the following proposition. First, the general proposition that atheism poisons everything. And second, the ancillary proposition that for sure religion poisons something. These propositions are not in conflict. And at the beginning of the discussion, I said they weren't in conflict. So asseverations to the contrary introduce into this discussion neither interesting evidence nor a valid argument. In terms of the social history of atheism, it seems to me, when I began this debate, and still seems to me now, overwhelmingly clear that while Nazism in Germany, communism in Russia, communism in China even, communism in Cambodia certainly had religious elements. Who would deny that? Why is that an interesting claim? The governing apparatus of ideology, no matter what Hitler had to say about his devotion to a warrior like Christ, involved the proposition among those who ruled these states and their entourage that no power was greater than their own. They acted on that proposition. They were restrained by nothing, and we saw the consequences. Now you may say, and perhaps say truly, that in their heart of hearts some Catholics adopted the rituals of the SS and took communion after an especially arduous day murdering innocent women in the fields of Poland. Could be true, I don't deny it. But what we must ask ourselves, if this is to be an intellectually serious discussion, is not whether there were infiltrations of religious thought in the worst tyrannies of mankind. Of course there were. That goes without saying. But whether something fundamental had changed in the diapason of thought that made these atrocities possible, and I say yes, there was. I've argued as well that atheism as a position has a deforming influence on science, and I've given you my reasons. Finally, I have argued that atheism, insofar as it removes from the human context a brute sense of obligation based on fear, removes from the moral calculus profound and powerful reason not to do evil. I think there's no escaping this. It's unpleasant. I don't particularly like it. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't lived my life that way, but I recognize it as a fact. And I think we all must. With that said, I thank you for listening.
Well, I think perhaps I can help close the gap a little, the gap that Professor Belinsky complains of in my closing remarks. I came across a stray comment by George Orwell, of whom I'm a great admirer, in a little-known essay recently, in which he said, at root, all totalitarianism must be theocratic. And I thought of my most admired author, that's rather stretching it. It's certainly possible to admire totalitarianism, to identify totalitarianisms that are not explicitly religious. He went on to clarify it a bit. He said, the reason I say it's theocratic is this. In all such dictatorships, there must be certain unchallengeable assumptions, some things that are beyond discussion, that are not available for debate, that must be taken as statements of faith. In other words, in Italy, for example, under fascism, il duce ha sempre ragione, the leader is always right. Of course, the cult of the Führer. The view that Stalin could bring 2 or 3 crops a year and was the great protector of the people, the worship of Mao, to take the other great element of the Axis powers, Japan, the emperor was actually a god, couldn't have anything more theocratic than that, though he had secular appearance as well. Now, if you think of totalitarianism in that way, and if you think of that as the greatest poison, since I'm accused not of mentioning poison enough or stressing it enough, then you'll see that the charge that is essentially theocratic is true because it depends upon unchallengeable statements, dogma, and faith. I don't know if anyone wants to name to me, or whether David will take up the challenge, a statement of atheism that is a statement purely of faith, independent of evidence, requiring no reasoning, and above all, punishable if challenged. I don't believe you can come up with anything of the sort. To the contrary, the little faction with which I'm honored to be identified as a junior member is adamant for doubt, is resolved to be skeptical, is certain only of the principle of uncertainty, and says that what we have yet to know is enormously greater than anything we have discovered or known so far, and that and only that is the test of education, of intellectual integrity, of honesty and inquiry, and, yes, let's hope for it, the emancipation of humans from man-made, and I stress man-made, delusions, including hopeful ones, including false consolation. And thus again, and I'll close by repeating myself, I've done worse, it is only those who claim to know things like the mind of God and the origins and destination and intention of the universe. It is they and only they who owe the explanation, and so far this evening haven't cared to furnish it. Thank you.
We now move to the question and answer time of this evening, and we begin with Christopher Hitchens. And Christopher, your first question: what are the weaknesses of Pascal's wager?
Well, sometimes known, by the way, as Pascal's gambit, which is, I think, a suggestive coinage. For those of you who don't know, or who might be watching and for whom this is new, I'll just state it, I hope not too crudely. Blaise Pascal, who was one of the founders of probability theory and a great mathematician and a great Catholic apologist of the 17th century, phrased it like this. He was addressing the people he called those who are so made that they cannot believe. That's me, for example. And he said, well, if you can't believe, think of it like this. If you bet that making the right adjustments to your relationship with God will save you in the future, in a future state, and you're right, you win a lot. If you're wrong, what have you lost? What have you got to lose? Now, the reason why I say wager and gambit are appropriate for this is it's obviously a very hucksterish claim, or offer, I mean to say. It's pretty cheap and pretty vulgar, and I would say especially so when offered to people who are dying or ill or frightened or in extremis. I think it's distinctly nasty and sharp practice to try it on them, but I think it's pretty sharp and nasty at any time. And you'll notice that it postulates, and here are its other weaknesses, two things. One, a very cynical and gullible God who will, if I say to him, tell you what, I'll give up the convictions of a lifetime, fling myself at your feet, pretend I believe, hope you're impressed, would say, yeah, that's good, that's progress. In other words, you get no reward for intellectual consistency, courage, honesty, anything of that sort. And of course, as with all these human-made ideas of divine tribunals, no lawyer to represent you, no appeal, and no opportunity to produce any evidence. I pass over that lightly and say, what does it ask also of the wager? It asks for someone to be a credulous, cringing, unprincipled serf who says, sure, what are principles for if not to be sold in the hope of a future boon? Well, those are the largest, I think, shortcomings of Pascalian, and by implication, all other religious reasoning about the death judgment and the other last things. Thank you.
Dr. Belinsky, what are the strengths of Pascal's wager? Very good.
That from a distinguished mathematician. They're still no.
Would you, Christopher Hitchens, would you agree with the following statement made by Sam Harris? And I quote, "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them."
You would be idle in dismissing it at the first reading, and obviously Sam has put it at its most blunt. But I'll give you a very practical example of a current theocratic dictatorship. We've all wondered, at least everyone of my age has since they were small, what will happen the day that a really nasty guy gets hold of a really bad weapon? That was how I thought about it when I was 7. I would now say, what happens when a messianic regime lays hold of an apocalyptic weapon? Well, we're about to find out. And the people who have plagiarized the ingredients of this weapon, stolen it from piracy on the high seas, broken every international law, every agreement, every treaty they've ever signed with the UN, the Atomic Energy Authority, the EU, and so forth, are governed by the totalitarian theory called the velayat du faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, the supreme leader. Notice that again, another supreme leader, another divinely inspired dictator whose word cannot be challenged and who wants to bring on the end of days. It's not the least of my dislikes of religion that it has openly or covertly an expressed wish, a clear one, for the end of the world. It doesn't like this world, wants it to finish. People who are in the process of acquiring the secular weaponry with which to bring about genocide deserve, I think, to have their ideology treated as toxic and its characters as dangerous vermin and as, like pirates and terrorists, people who it is lawful to destroy. Yes, so to that extent I'm with Sam, sure.
Dr. Berlinski, you're not a Christian, and indeed you're not religious, as I understand it. Why do you argue for the influence of Christianity or a Judeo-Christian influence in society?
I presume you're not asking that in the hopes of a personal declaration. I mean, I argue for a great many things, and my personal involvement in topics for debate is variable. This particular question strikes me as more important and more demanding of a personal involvement than most. I think the issue is tremendously significant. I think if we're honest about the times in which we live, it's quite right what Matthew Arnold suggested. The sea of faith has been receding under the power of a variety of forces, and the results have, in a certain way, been catastrophic for the human race. I should not say that a secular Jew has a remarkable degree of authority when it comes to discussing these events. After all, I have lived my own life under the impress of the maxim to have a good time all the time. But on the other hand, it doesn't hurt to hear these words from someone such as myself, because at least you are hearing these words for someone with no conceivable bias in their favor. I count myself as an objective observer of the circumstances. So perhaps that's the only reasonable answer I can give. These are important questions. They've had horrific consequences in human history. They continue to have horrific consequences, especially in intellectual history. And in response to why should it be that a secular Jew opens his mouth on questions pertaining to the Christian religion?
10 seconds.
It's a big tent. I'm presuming I will be welcome. Thank you.
Christopher Hitchens, what specific teachings of Jesus do you believe to be evil or poisonous?
The concept of vicarious redemption is the most repulsive, I think, and the most central. I mean, I could pick a lot of peripheral utterances of the Nazarene, or alleged utterances of the Nazarene, but the inescapable one, the one that none of his followers troubles to deny, that he is the idea that by throwing your sins onto somebody else, onto a scapegoat, you can have them annealed, polished. That is a disgusting and immoral doctrine. If I care for you enough, I can pay your debt, even if you incurred it out of your own stupid irresponsibility. I could, if I wished, and it's been done, offer to take your place in prison, though not many people will allow the exchange, or if you were a hostage. I could do that if I loved you enough, and there are examples of people willing to put themselves forward as the substitute for someone's execution. I suppose Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities is the best-known folkloric one, but you cannot relieve people of their responsibility. And it's immoral to offer to do so, and it would be disgusting if it could be done. So the moral rot of Christianity is, I think, exposed in its central doctrine of vicarious forgiveness. It's an abdication of moral responsibility. I think the idea of taking no thought for the morrow, of the instructions are, abandon your family. If you don't, you are one who hates me. Give up investment, thrift, any thought of a future, children, architecture, anything of the sort. Forget all that and follow me, is moral only on one condition, and it's the condition I referred to before, that the world is about to come to an end, and that only those who stick by me, a familiar trope from deluded prophets throughout the ages, are going to get out of it. Again, I would say a multiply wicked thing to be saying and offer to be making. We would be so much better off without this cult. We would think so much more clearly about the real moral questions that confront us. Thank you.
Given this choice and no other, would you prefer a secular or an Islamic Europe?
What, my dear sir, makes you think it's a choice right now? Large portions of Europe are already Islamic. I mean, how would I adjust the European continent? I have no opinion. Why should I judge the European continent? As far as I can tell, having conducted a relationship with the Arab community for more than 11 years, I have no objections to Muslims in Europe.
David, do you mind if I breached convention to one degree and say why I think you could have answered that better?
Sure.
I mean, because it implied in your view that atheism poisons everything. Is it not, and I think this was the intention of the question anyway, that I'd be better off as a Wahhabi than I would as an atheist? Now, what Larry, I think, was trying to ask you is, do you seriously maintain any such thing?
You mean with respect to Europe?
Would Europe be better religious but Islamic or without God? Is, I think, the question, is it not? And I miniaturized it for myself. I invite you to take another run at it.
Yeah.
In fact, I strongly advise it, and you can have it out of my time.
This is a forced choice. Which would you prefer? An Islamic Europe? Would you like to live in an Islamic Europe, or would you do live in Europe, or would you prefer to live in a secular?
The trouble is the question has no provocative urgency for me. It has none whatsoever. I mean, it's like asking which I would prefer, to be dressed in gold or in silver. It's not a living issue.
Right. Christopher, do you believe that all, and this is, by the way, is your last question, so at the end, take an extra minute or so to summarize your arguments and to make a final statement. Do you believe that all religions are equally poisonous?
My beloved younger daughter today became a senior at Sidwell Friends School in Washington. So at least I know that she's under serious police guard during the day. And as its name implies, this is a Quaker foundation where, if she hasn't understood the story of Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and many other people by now, it's not for want of trying. And so would I not be fatuous or demagogic if I said that Quakerism to me is exactly the same as Wahhabism or the Twelver Shiite theory of the Velayat-e Faqih, the Khomeini theory? Of course not. But religions, different ones, do take their turn at bat, I think, to show how dangerous the religious proposition is. Quakers, for example, expelled from their ranks those who supported the American Revolution because they thought that they'd taken an oath of loyalty and that it transcended all other principles, and there had to be another Quaker meeting set up in Philadelphia, chucked out. Betsy, an Episcopalian, and so on. The more you look at some of these supposedly innocuous sects, you realize they're only innocuous because they've become so by having their fangs drawn by civil society over the years. When Jefferson says to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, don't worry, you live in a country that has a wall of separation between church and state, and it will ever be thus. Who can tell me? Actually, I've got a better chance in Birmingham of getting someone. Who were the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut afraid of? Oh, come on. Oh, come on. The Congregationalists. One in Alabama. The Congregationalists of Danbury, Connecticut thought that Baptists shouldn't be citizens. So, I've only got a minute. So, just as I would have said 50 years ago, the Catholic Church is by far the most dangerous because of its open, soggy, disgusting, rotten alliance with fascism, which it didn't get over till well after the Second World War. Obviously now Islam, which had been going through a long period of latency, is by far the most dangerous religion. But yes, they all make the same mistake. They all take the only real faculty we have that distinguishes us from other primates and from other animals, the faculty of reason, and the willingness to take any risk that reason demands of us, and they replace that with the idea that faith is a virtue. If I could change just one thing, it would be to dissociate the idea of faith from virtue, now and for good, and to expose it for what it is, a servile weakness, a refuge in cowardice, and a willingness to follow, with credulity, people who are in the highest degree unscrupulous. Thank you.
Your final question, and at the end, you may summarize your arguments. What is one to make of the claim, or rather, what do you make of the claim that science and Christianity are in opposition to one another?
What am I to make of the claim that science and Christianity are in opposition to one another? I would need to hear the claim reticulated properly. To claim a point of opposition in general seems to me unhelpful. To claim points of opposition in particular seems to me rather more reasonable. In its largest aspect, Western science is, of course, an outgrowth of the Judeo-Christian tradition, especially to the extent, and perhaps only to the extent, that it is committed to the principle that the universe, the manifest universe, contains a latent structure that can be discovered by the intellect of man. I think this is true. I don't think this is very far from Gerard Manley Hopkins' declaration that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. They represent rather the same position in the world of thought. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, therefore it can be rationally comprehended. Please notice, This is very different from a Muslim claim. It's very different from the Islamic tradition in which God is assigned rather a capricious role. There is a reason that Muslim science, so fecund and glorious in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, did come to an end unceremoniously. And it can be traced back to Muslim theological writings. So yes, I would say the Judeo-Christian tradition, the tradition of a revealed religion that is revealed in nature, but pointing to a supernatural order, has been a powerful influence on the development of Western science, one, by the way, recognized by virtually every significant scientist, every single one of them. What do I have next?
1 minute for closing remarks.
I certainly have no objection to repeating myself, but whether you're equally willing to hear myself repeated, I don't know. I've offered you 3 considerations. I've listened very respectfully to what Mr. Hitchens has said, and I have found myself, as he expected, immeasurably improved. However, I have heard nothing that discourages me or dissuades me from affirming the propositions that I have affirmed. The influence of atheism, even though religions have done dreadful things, has been poisonous for at least 300 years, and especially poisonous in the 20th century. Second, atheism is a position in thought, a dogmatic position in thought, an asseveration that there is no God, has had a deforming influences on the sciences because it leaves open unanswered questions that press on the human heart. And third, that atheism inevitably, in the moral sphere, leaves unanswered the question, what obliges us? What forces us? Not what persuades us, what forces us to behave as we should. Thank you.